Good afternoon and welcome to this installment of the Boost Your Skills webinar series, where we enlist the advice of specialist experts in order to help you make the most out of your university experience and to acquire the skills to help you succeed and develop both professionally and on a personal level. I am Siddharth and joining me is Jenny, and we are your Boost Your Skills team. This event is in webinar format, so you will not be able to turn on your cameras and mics, but we would still love to hear from you through the chat function. This is a safe space with no judgments being passed, so please feel free to ask questions without fear or worry. If you are still anxious, feel free to message Jenny or myself anonymously and we will pass it on. The webinar will consist of an interactive presentation which contains polls and some time at the end for Q&A. The event is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel, so don't worry if you've missed something. We'll be sharing a link to the video and slides after the event. Finally, a big thank you to all our attendees who pre-submitted questions. Now, I'd like to hand over to Maria from Sage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Maria, Marketing Manager for Study Skills at Sage. I'm really delighted to introduce you to our author, Dave Rush. Dave is Student Development Manager at the University of Essex, and he has a particular interest in teaching writing, critical thinking, and reading skills. Could you go to the next slide, please? So today's webinar will show you how to build great arguments, no matter the subject you study. The webinar will bring to life tried and tested tips from Dave's books, both Build Your Argument, which is a super quick pocket-sized guide to argument building, and the Essential Guide to Building Your Argument, which comes out in May and takes a deep dive into argumentation skills, showing you everything you need to know to develop compelling written and verbal arguments. So if you want to find out more about the books, just scan the QR code or head to the John Smith student stores. Both books are discounted now on their website. And that's all from me today. Now over to you, Dave.
Thanks very much, Maria, and thanks very much everyone for coming as well. It's a pleasure to be here. So, discussing how to build arguments and understand them at university is a huge topic, obviously, and one that involves practically every academic skill that you could think of, from critical thinking and research skills, all the way to good writing, to structuring, to academic style. It's also something that varies hugely from department to department, I'm not at university today, from discipline to discipline, from subject to subject, and also what level you're at. Now, I know from looking at the breakdown of who's booked onto this today that we have students from all the way from first year undergrad all the way up to PhD, and we have university staff here as well. So what all that means is, the reason I'm saying that is it means that I can't make what we're going to discuss today either level specific, so I can't make it targeted at the particular level of study you're at, and I also can't make it discipline specific, so I can't make it particularly about the subject that you study. However, what I'm going to try and do is talk about some principles, and most importantly, some key questions that I want to give you that you can take away and apply to your own situation so that you can build arguments most effectively in your academic context and for your purposes. So what that means in practice is there are three things that we're going to do. So I want to look at how we read for argument rather than just facts. Secondly, I want to think about how we build our own arguments in an academic context, being careful to think about both where we want to get to, but also where we come from. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then lastly, there'll be time for you to answer any questions. Now, Maria Siddharth will be looking at the chat as we go along. I will try and keep an eye on chat as we go, but with lots of people here, it might not be possible for me to do that. But please do put questions in as we go. And if I can, I'll answer them as I go, but if not, don't worry, there'll be plenty of time for me to come to them at the end. Okay, so hopefully that all sounds okay. Now, what I'd like to do to start off with then is just a little exercise to get us warmed up. And what I'm going to ask you is, I'm going to show you a meme that was circulated quite widely in 2015 to 2016, that sort of time. Now, I'm going to apologize to you. This involves Donald Trump, So be warned about that. I'm also going to apologize to you because I'm aware that for someone of my age, discussing things that happened in 2015 feels like a very recent, up-to-date, on the ball example. I'm aware that for some of you who are a lot younger than I am, this might feel like something from ancient history. But anyway, the context of this is we're talking about when Donald Trump was running for president of the United States, running as the Republican candidate. So I'm sure you will know this, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, there are two main political parties in the US, the Republicans, who are on the right, and the Democrats are on the left, kind of broadly speaking, the analogues to the Conservatives and the Labour Party in this country. Donald Trump was standing as a candidate for the Republicans. And this was an example of a meme that circulated widely at the time. Okay, so it says, it's a picture of Donald Trump, and beneath it, it says, if I were to run, I'd run as a Republican. They're the dumbest group of voters in the country. They believe anything on Fox News. I could lie and they'd still eat it up. I bet my numbers would be terrific. And the meme suggests that Donald Trump said this in People magazine in 1998. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about, I will unpack this a little bit afterwards, but all I want you to do for now is just look at that. And I want you to tell me whether or not you think it's true. So I don't want you to tell me whether or not you really think that Republicans are stupid. What I want you is to tell me, do you think that Trump actually said this? Now, please don't just Google this. I want you to just use the evidence that's in front of you. And then, so first of all, you're just being asked to vote on whether you think he did or did not say this. But I also want you to think about why you're saying that. So in other words, what helped you decide on your answer? What's the evidence that you're drawing on in that picture? Okay, so I'll just give you another minute or so for people to have a look and to think about it and then vote. I'm not going to give you not sure as an answer. You have to come down on one side or the other, I'm afraid, but don't worry, the poll is anonymous, so you won't be held to it. As I said, the question is not, are Republicans stupid and will they believe anything on Fox News? The question is, did Donald Trump actually say this? Okay, I'll give you another 15, 20 seconds. There's still 15 or 16 of you that haven't voted yet. Okay, let's call it quits though, even if there are still more of you to vote. Did you show everyone the results, or shall I do that? So that you could do it. Brilliant. Okay, so as you can see, about 60% of you said yes, he did, and 40% of you said no, he didn't. Now, I'd be really interested to hear in chat why people thought that. So what evidence was there in that made you think he did or he didn't? If anyone, just type in anything you think in chat, anything you looked at and thought, yes, that makes me believe it. Okay, so someone says they quoted him. Okay, so that suggests that he said it, yeah. It's quotation marks. It looks like it's taking the exact words. Yeah, anything else? The fact that it's got the source there and it's got People magazine listed, yeah, that suggests that it's likely. Trump says ridiculous things all the time. Yes, it does sound like the sort of thing that he would say. Trump hates journalists. That's it. After hearing all his speeches, absolutely. So rhetorically, it sounds like something he would say. The fact that there's a reference there to a magazine that you might have heard of, People magazine, it's very him. That's a very good way of putting it. The reference to Fox News makes it seem likely as well. Yeah. Someone else has said it's just a magazine, no empirical evidence, so perhaps that makes it doubtful. It's an old picture of him. That's an interesting point as well. So the picture there on immediate view, that makes it seem like it might make it seem convincing, but actually, is that what Donald Trump looked like in 1998? Someone said, not sure Fox News was available at the time. I'll come back to that point because that's a very important one. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, any other last thoughts? Is the statement being edited together? I mean, it seems like a long quote to put it in one word. Inflammatory quotes, some magazines, yeah, absolutely. All of these things. It's created to serve a particular purpose, Carol. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think someone is questioning what we say about magazines, but there's a question there, but it's created to serve a particular purpose. And I think the key point there is actually the meme was created to serve a particular purpose. The quote, so there's two things here. When I do this exercise, people naturally, because what I ask them to do, tend to focus on the quote and the fact that it came from a magazine. But actually, you're right. It's very important to think about the meme and the purpose that was created for as well. Someone said post-truth media as well. That's also an interesting point that we can come back to. Okay, you've raised a lot of the things that I wanted to highlight. Is there anything, any last takers for anything else they want to add in that they thought was interesting there? No, okay. I'm just going to close the poll window if that's okay. So that his behaviour, someone said as well. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is just sum up kind of some of the things that we said there, and let's talk through it, and then I'll give you the answer of whether it is a yes or a no. So what evidence have we got here for and against from what you've just said? Basically, there are lots of possible reasons why you might have thought that quote was real if you came across it in the lead up to the presidential election on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might have been. And the first would have been actually just the fact that you were coming across it on Facebook or Twitter or the social media of choice. The fact that someone else had shared it, because that's one of the things that makes memes like that, whether they're fake or real, so effective. It's the fact that knowledge has been shared in the first place. The very fact that it's circulating wildly is not the word I meant, widely is the word I meant. But that suggests that other people believe it, and that makes you think that it's likely to believe it, because surely someone would have checked, right? You're not just allowed to share things that aren't true. People don't just make things that aren't true. So our instinct is to believe what we see, perhaps less so now, ironically, than we were then before that election. But there are also lots of details within it that make it seem plausible. So like a lot of you said, it sounds like Donald Trump. Anyone who's familiar with how he speaks, it matches his rhetorical style. Like you can almost hear him saying it. They've written it. It's written in a way, I'm perhaps giving the game away here, but it's written in a way that makes it sound very much like Donald Trump. And it's not just that it sounds like him rhetorically. So in other words, in terms of the way that he constructs language, it also actually matches a lot of the sort of things that he did say around that time. So he famously said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose voters. So it sounds like him, and it's the sort of thing he would say, like you all said. And there's also a reference, vitally, okay, which adds, which really makes it seem much more convincing because it suggests that it's verifiable, right? It suggests that you can go and check easily whether this is real or not. Now, you probably wouldn't actually ever bother to go and check yourself if you came up, because you'd be looking at it on your phone or, in a break from work or whatever. But there's a reference there, seems convincing. And then there's also that picture, which somehow, when you stop to think about it, it's kind of worrying that that's all it takes to convince you. But somehow, if someone sticks a picture next to it, it makes it seem more true. Verisimilitude just means the appearance of being true, which I only included because I like the word verisimilitude really, rather than it necessarily being important here. But there are also lots of things that should make us suspicious about this picture, yeah. So the first one is that the picture, as someone said, is an old picture. Now, this is supposed to be from a magazine, but actually that doesn't look like the sort of picture that you get in a magazine interview. You get lots of wonderfully posed photos in a magazine photo shoot. And in fact, if it's Donald Trump involved, it's normally him like sitting astride a golden lion or something. And that's not even a joke. There is actually a picture of him doing that in his penthouse in Trump Tower. So why have they chosen this picture of him on a TV chat show, which is what it is? It's a random still from an interview in a TV chat show in the 1980s. So it's 10 years before the quote says it's from, which should give us pause, right? And the second thing is that reference is actually in itself incomplete. Okay, there's a number of things about that reference. The first thing is that it's incomplete. So People magazine is a weekly magazine, which is hundreds of pages long each time. That reference does not tell us what date it was that was published or what page. So if you were going to verify that, particularly if People magazine haven't digitized their back catalogue, which I think is quite likely, then you're going to have to go through an awful lot of text in order to find out whether or not this was really true. And secondly, some people kind of touched on this. How trustworthy is People magazine? I mean, certainly we'll talk about an academic context in a second, but certainly in an academic context, it's not. Its purpose is a tabloid newspaper. It's there. What it wants to do is sell copies, and it probably cares about that first and the truth later. I should remember that this is also being shown on YouTube, so I don't want to say anything too defamatory about large American publications. But yes, as someone said in chat, the photo is there because it looks like him sitting an interview. I get it, but again, it adds that appearance of being true. You look at it and you think there's a man being interviewed. Here's a quote from that interview. You don't necessarily stop to interrogate it more than that. Now, as I said, when someone talked about the purpose this was created, we also need to think about the question of who wrote this and why. So not the original text so much, but actually the meme. Who created the meme? So we've got a reference for the quote, but what about the reference for the meme itself? Now, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of that image, there's actually a little watermark that says the other 98. And that is the group, apparently, that made and circulated that meme. Now, again, the other 98 might not mean anything to you these days. The idea of the other 98 became popular around the kind of Occupy Wall Street movements about 10 years ago in the early 2010s. And the idea was that 2% of the world's population controlled 98% of the world's resources. So the richest people on the planet, well, there's only 2% of them, but they control 98%. And the other 98% of people were kind of you and me, you know, the people who should be fighting back against these rich 2% and their control. So you can see why a group like that probably are not sympathetic to the ultra right-wing billionaire Donald Trump, right? Now, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily fabricated, but it should tell us that whatever the purpose for it being shared is probably not positive towards Donald Trump. I'm going to come back to that question of why it was created in a minute. But first of all, let's consider a couple of other points about whether or not this is true. So the first one is what's called confirmation bias, okay? In other words, many of the people who encountered this meme when it came across their eyeballs, they would have wanted it to be true because it already fitted with their view of the world. Okay, this is what confirmation bias means. It's our tendency to accept things that support our existing ideas and reject things that don't. And so they would have been primed to believe it, in other words. The final thing that we need to be aware of, and someone mentioned this, is that there's a clear factual error in there. Now, it's not that Fox News didn't exist before 2001, it did, but really its reputation, it was just like any other local news channel. It didn't establish its reputation as this kind of cheerleader for the ultra right wing in America until after, first of all, the election of George Bush in 2000, secondly, after the 9/11 in 2001, and thirdly, after the Iraq War in 2003. Now, many of you, that's all before you were born, so why would you have known that? But the key thing it tells us is that this quote was written with 2016 in mind, not 1998. When it was supposedly said. That quote wouldn't have made any sense in 1998 because they would have gone, why is he talking about Fox News? What's that mean? So that tells us, as you've probably guessed from everything I've just said, that the quote is not true. Donald Trump never actually said that. Even without knowing all of the factual points that we've just looked at, like the thing about Fox News, it was kind of largely possible to work that out just from looking at it. But why then did someone create this? So what was the purpose? So it's not true, but why was it made? What was the purpose behind that? Or to put it another way, what argument were they trying to make? So just give you a second just to think about that. Why do you think this was produced? What's the point of making up a quote and sharing it in this way? What argument is being made here? I can see some. To discredit, propaganda, building public opinion. Yeah, I mean, I think that broadly sums it up, really. That we can't know for certain why this was created. We can't even know for certain if it was created by a group called the Other 98, or if there even is a group called the Other 98. I mean, there is. We don't know if they created this. However, there are several arguments that we could say are being made here to discredit Trump. People are saying, yeah, broadly speaking, the meme uses a credible impersonation of Trump to remind readers, first of all, how many disparaging things he says about people. So the first intention is to discredit him, you're right, by showing the number of rude things that he says about people. The second thing it's trying to do is to make the suggestion, Yeah, absolutely, Shazia. As you say, they want Trump to lose support of Republicans by making jokes about them. So what they're trying to say, in other words, is do not vote for this man, either because he's just as much of a liar as you always thought he was and is a deeply unpleasant human being. So if you're a Democrat, you were never going to vote for him anyway. This just reconfirms your perception that he's an arsehole and you shouldn't vote for him. Excuse my language. Or secondly, if he's a Republican who he's trying to win you round, and the meme is trying to say, don't fall for it, he hates you and he's laughing at you. He thinks you're an idiot, so don't vote for him. Okay? And that, you know, he's trying to say he's going to represent these people, but actually he holds them in contempt. However, is that the effect that this had? Because immediately you're right. You look at it and you say this was clearly made to discredit Trump, and it was made in order to stop people voting for him. But did it work? Well, the answer is no, obviously, in one way, because people did vote for him. He became president. And the other thing that's worth thinking about is this is the period that was really key in the development of what we now call fake news, what someone in the chat called the post-truth era, and the kind of prevalent distrust of everything, which is now so prevalent in public discourse. So that fed into Trump's campaign and ultimately helped him win. So, I mean, if you were a conspiracy theorist, you could even argue that maybe it was someone on Trump's side who made this meme, so that it could be proven to be false. And then in the argument about something that was fake, all of the things that he said that were true could be ignored. Now, I'm not saying that's the truth. I mean, it could have been made by a Russian, cyber bot equally. That's not really important. And the reason why we did that, this is obviously not directly useful in an academic context, because in an academic context, you're hopefully not going to be coming across sources that are actively trying to trick you or present things that are false as reality. But what it is an example of how active reading can help us to evaluate a source, and also to crucially think about what the implicit purpose of a text is, what the arguments around a text are. So initially what I asked you to do was just to judge whether something was a fact or not. And just from looking at that, we've actually already quite quickly extrapolated out to lots of arguments that surround this source, okay, from a very simple image on the surface. So what I want to do from that is let's just take a few things away from that exercise that we can use to think about how we read for argument and what I mean by that and why it's important. So the first thing is that idea of, well, there's a few things here. So the first thing is to say that idea that I raised at the beginning, the idea that we believe something just because it's been shared, is similar to a set of cognitive biases or a set of ways that we approach text that we need to be aware of in an academic context as well, because basically we have a tendency to approach academic sources as authoritative because they're written by experts. And I mean we should, reliable academic texts are authoritative, but that doesn't mean that you should just agree with them or believe them or passively accept what they say. You have to read them critically and actively. Now, critical doesn't mean negative in an academic sense. So I don't mean you have to say that something is wrong or find flaws with it. A critical reading could be very positive and say that something is a brilliant example, a brilliantly argued piece. All it means is that you don't just accept what it says. You ask questions of it, you test its qualities, you check it, you think about it really carefully. And also this feeds into something else, because as students, often we feel inferior to the sources that we read, and we feel inferior to the lecturers that we listen to, because we know how much they know, and we are over aware of our own flaws. But actually, as a student, you have to approach it as an equal member of the academic community who has a right to question that text and to think about it carefully. It's also about a change in mindset, which could be either a change in mindset from what you're used to in school or at a lower level of study, or it could be if you come from a different educational culture. Think about how you were expected to engage with sources in your previous studies. It might be a lot of the time that what you were expected to do was learn something and then be able to repeat back the key parts of it at a later date. That's not what is being asked of you at university in this country, either at an undergraduate or postgraduate level. Okay, you're being asked to show how you can take knowledge and use it, but also how you can engage with the knowledge in your subject and really pull it apart and make arguments with it. Okay, The other thing about it is there's another cognitive bias, which Daniel Kahneman, the guy who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and is a very famous psychologist, calls what you see is all there is. And that is our tendency to basically engage with sources and engage with arguments based purely based on what we can see, what's in front of us. So in other words, when we read a text, we do all have a tendency to just engage with the terms that text sets for us. But by thinking actively and by being a good student at university, what you remind yourself to do is overcome those biases, which you can do, but you have to make a conscious effort to try and step outside of that context and make sure that you're bringing other things to bear on it, to read it critically, being questioning, okay? The second thing that we have to think about is context and assumptions. And what I mean by that, looking at memes, as I said, is really interesting. Well, it is to me anyway, although every time I say the word memes, I feel like even more of a dinosaur because I've got no idea what someone who's 18 would think about that now. Anyway, the reason I say it's interesting is because there's so much information being conveyed in such a short space as we looked at. And the reason for that is that most interpretation of text is not just about the words that are there. Okay, it's about all of the things that are associated with that, the context, the assumptions that are contained with that. Now here, in the case of Trump, those were things like our perceptions of him as a person, our awareness of the political situation, our awareness of the history that's happened since that time. You know, all of those things that were immediately triggered by our looking at that meme, and we used that knowledge to interpret it without even thinking about it. But all of that was invoked in everything that you said about it, okay? The same thing happens in an academic context. Now, what it is that you're invoking, what it is that's being triggered is different. And often part of the process of becoming a student is learning to understand what it is you should be triggering as a student of that discipline. Okay, so what I mean by that is understanding what has fed into the way that what you're reading has been created. So either a text that you're reading or just the knowledge that you're interacting with, the data that you're looking at, how has that been produced? You know, so if it is data, then what is the shared understanding of methodology and interpretation that underpins that data and the way it's presented? There are rules about this stuff in an academic context, and your understanding of that will enable you to judge whether or not that data is reliable, valid, and also whether the conclusions that have been based on that data are valid. If we're talking about a text, it's the same thing, or, you know, a discursive or an argumentative text. What debates does that link to? Why is it being written? What is it responding to? How does it fit in with other arguments that have been made? All of these things will help you to have a much better understanding of what that text is trying to do, rather than just looking at what it presents and passively accepting it. And the final thing, which kind of is a logical extension of what I just said, is that arguments are everywhere. Okay, so it's not a case that you should be reading for fact and then kind of thinking about the arguments as a second part. It's fundamental that you're thinking about those arguments absolutely all the time. Because as I said, that initial meme that we looked at, initially it just looked like an exercise in is this true? But actually, from the moment you looked at it, loads of arguments had started running, and we were thinking in that context. This is true in academia, and it's not just true in the obvious places like philosophy or history, you know, where where it's very obvious how you're dealing with arguments all the time. In philosophy, it might be very obvious in other means. It applies to every subject, even the hardest of sciences, okay? Because every fact in a scientific context, as Steve, to sort of paraphrase Stephen Hawking badly, he says, every theory is a model of reality that has no other relationship with their reality. What he means is when we test something, when we come up with facts, what we do is construct models and test those. And in that construction, there are arguments and assumptions, and all of those things have been made. And even if you don't accept that, we don't need to get into an argument about relativism today. What you have to accept is that the way that those facts are then interpreted involve arguments. So, for example, if you're a marine biologist, you might argue with me that there are absolutely facts that you can establish about what it is that's killing coral reefs. But if you then want to get into a conversation about how we stop that, what's the best way to preserve those coral reefs, arguments are going to come into play. And these arguments are everywhere, from the first time you start reading something, to the discussions you have in class, to the experiments you do, to the text that you write. And what you need to do is think about how that works in your discipline. Okay, and learn the rules of how it works in your discipline. And in the second half of this, what I'm going to hopefully try and do is think about some of the questions that you can ask, no matter what subject it is you're looking at, that you can then take to work this out. Okay. So quickly, before I move on to that, the one other thing I wanted to say is it's worth noting that the way that I gave my response to whether or not that Trump meme was true was also an example of structuring an argument for effect. Okay. So what I did was this. I said it looks convincing, and if you like, you can see that the points in the two halves mirror each other. So in the first half, I said it sounds like Trump, it matches his style, it looks like the sort of thing that he says. There's a reference, so we think it's convincing. And also there's a picture, so we think it must be true. But then that picture, I used it as a pivot point to say, well, actually, but that picture's not reliable. That picture should give us pause because it's from an old picture from a TV appearance in the 1980s, so it doesn't match up. And then I also said, well, actually, the source is not entirely trustworthy. First of all, because it's not complete. Second of all, because it's a tabloid. And thirdly, we need to think about the source, not just for the quote, but the source for the meme. And then I said, well, actually, even the fact that it's convincing just plays into confirmation bias. So there we've got a complete mirroring of the structure. The second half has ticked off every reason that I gave in the first half. And then we had the kicker, which is the thing that I'd held back, which was the factual error. Now, that would have had a lot less impact if I'd given you the factual mistake at first and then given all the others. It also would have had less impact if I'd given you the reasons why it wasn't true first, because so I argued what I wanted to say second in order for that to be what I left you with, so that I progressively knocked down the reasons why something wasn't true, and then gave you the reasons why it was. So by the end, it was more convincing. Now that's just one example of way of structuring an argument. And what I want to do next, as I said, is talk about how you build your own arguments. That's an example of one way of doing it. But it's very easy when you do this sort of session for me to now turn this into something like a here's how you structure an essay type session, or here's how you analyze an essay question. And I don't want to do that, because for me, that's something different. That sort of structure that I'm giving you there works very well for a particular type of discursive essay. But actually, for huge swathes of argument at university, it doesn't really actually have that much, utility. So it looks neat, but it's not practically necessarily going to be of use to a lot of you watching this webinar. So instead, what I want to do is think about the kind of questions that we can use every time we need to build an argument. Okay. First of all, actually, the sort of more questioning amongst you might have noticed that I haven't actually defined what an argument is yet in an academic context. So that's the first thing I want to do before we go any further. So, and that is to say that the word argument, it doesn't mean the same thing in an academic context as it does in everyday speech. So it doesn't mean a debate or a conflict. An argument refers to a position that is taken in response to a particular question or issue, supported by the propositions or the reasons why you think that position is true. Okay, so it says here is an answer. Here is a position. Here is what you should think about a particular thing. And at university, as a student, whether you're an undergrad, a postgrad, or an independent researcher, the term argument then is used to refer to both where you get to that final position, but it's also used to refer to everything you did along the way to reach that point. So when lecturers, if the lecturer marks your work and says, oh, the argument needs work, they could be referring to either your overall answer, but probably also the logical chain that you went through to get there. In other words, every point that you made along the way, which should also be backed up by evidence and ordered logically so that you reach the clear conclusion. So that's what I mean when I say building your own argument. Again, that the same applies in every different context. Arguments appear everywhere, as I said. So an argument, for example, could be a direct response to an essay question, which is the example I'm going to look at in a second. An argument could equally be an argument about why there's a gap in research. So you could conduct a literature review and say, here is what everyone else has said on this question, but what they haven't done is said this. And the reason why that's important is this, and therefore this is why we need this piece of research. That is an argument about why a particular piece of research is done. Then that same piece of research might make an argument about why a particular method is important in order to carry out that question. and then make an argument about why the data they found does or doesn't answer the original question. So literally arguments appear at every point. You could, even you could argue that, as we'll look at in a second, that lecturers have given you a particular piece of reading to read because they want to make an argument themselves. They want to make a particular case or argue a particular point. So arguments are all about questions, then, is what I'm saying here, and how to answer them. And in order to build good ones, we need to think carefully about both parts. Then we need to think about the answer, but also why the question is being asked, which might seem straightforward, but is actually often not. In order to show what I'm talking about, what I'm going to do is I am going to give you an example essay question. Okay, now this is taken from a real module that I designed and taught a few years ago at the University of Essex that was called British Society and Culture. See what you think of it. So this is the question. Feminism is the most important movement of the 20th century. Discuss. Now, as I said, if we were to turn this into analyzing an essay question or a structuring an essay type workshop, then I imagine what we would do is we would do something like, we would talk about, okay, you can break down essay titles by looking at the three common factors: the topic, in this case feminism, the limit or the scope, which is feminism as a movement in the 20th century, so which bit of that topic you're talking about, and then the task. So in this case, you're being asked to discuss that. You're being asked to show the different possible positions and the different approaches that people could take to answering this question, and then coming up with your own answer. Now, that is all absolutely valid. But as I said, it's not, I don't want to dwell on it too long today because that's not what I want to do right now. I don't know what your immediate response to this question would be, but often if I present this question to students, then they'll say, okay, well, and if I ask them what would they need to include, they'll say, oh, well, we need to talk about a history of feminism, or we need to discuss other possible movements that happened in the 20th century, and possibly the need to argue that another one was more important than feminism, or whatever it might be. And that might have been your immediate reaction to this question. All of that is valid. Now, in this, what I've done today is given you a question with no context, or very little context anyway. But the point I want to make is actually that is the vital starting point. All questions at university level, whether it is a first-year undergraduate or as a postgraduate taught student or a postgraduate researcher, all questions are not just general discussions of a topic. They are focused answers to particular questions that show not just what you know, but what you can do with that knowledge. Okay, and that means that you have to understand why the question is being asked and where that question is coming from. In other words, the answer that you could give to this question would vary hugely depending on when it had been set to you and in what context. So, right, I've just used the word context a lot. So what do I mean by that? How do you work out what that context is? How do we set our approach to this? And the answer is that there's a set of questions that you can ask yourself every time you'll set a question in order to work this out. And they are as follows. Okay, so what you need to be thinking about basically is be thinking about why. Why am I being asked that question? So as much as we need to do what I just said and analyze the question and think about the topic and blah, 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 you also need to be thinking about what's the context that this question is being set in. Why am I being asked it? So these are the questions you can ask yourself, okay? So why has my lecturer set this question? Why this question and not another question? Why is there not another question on feminism? You know, why didn't they choose to ask it? Why have they chosen to word it in this particular way? What are they pointing at? What are they getting at? What do they want me to think about? What do they think? What's going on here? Why have they chosen this question, and why have they chosen to word it in this particular way? So that's one thing you should be asking yourself. You should also be thinking, what debates or ideas does it link to that I've learned about on this course or this module? And what I mean there is remember that as any essay question or any assignment question or any question that you come across, any time that you're making an argument, you're always doing it within the context of a particular module. Even if you're writing a PhD, you're doing it within the context of the research question you've set yourself for that thesis. Okay, so you have to be asking how the question you're dealing with at that particular point links into all the debates and ideas in that context. If you go off and start talking about something outside of that, no matter how interesting it is, it won't be relevant to what's going on at that point. So students who answer the question that I set by talking about feminism outside of the context of the module no matter how interesting that is, I can't give them a mark because they're not showing me their engagement with that module. Okay, I'm not saying they have to be limited to that. They could bring in as many different ideas as they wanted to, as long as they did that in a way that addressed what I was asking them to do. Another way of thinking about this is so what lectures, what classes, what texts, when did we come across these ideas? When were they raised? What clues does that give me about what the lecturer wants me to talk about? What assumptions are being made here? Now, I'll talk about that in a second, what I mean in this particular case, but remember, that can mean all sorts of things. That could mean, is there a particular theoretical perspective that I need to understand to think about this question? I mean, in this case, there is, because we need to have an understanding of feminism, what it is, there's that. I'll talk about the assumptions of this particular question, but it could also, again, be if you're studying a subject in the social sciences, for example, then you can think about the methodology that was used for the article that you're reading. Why have they chosen a qualitative response rather than the quantitative? What's the assumption they're making about the type of question that they're asked? All of those sorts of things. Is there something in the way the question's worded that suggests that the lecturer thinks something particular? Are they hinting at a particular argument? What assumptions are being made? And then vitally, what am I being expected to demonstrate here in terms of both knowledge and skills? So, I am quite sort of romantic and humanities focused. Literature is my background, and I am very much buy into the idea of writing an essay as being an act of individual creative genius. So part of my soul dies every time I say things like this. But it is also very true that you have to think about this from a practical perspective. Okay, if you're writing a first-year undergraduate essay, or if you're writing a PhD thesis, you are doing that for a purpose. And you are doing it to demonstrate that you have the requisite knowledge and skills to get the qualification that you're seeking. Okay, how are you going to do that in that piece of work in order to get the mark that you want, or to get the pass, or whatever it might be? So what can you demonstrate in this? Now, often in the context that I'm talking about here, it's your ability to construct a logical, sound, valid argument in response to a particular question. But it can be more than that. It could be you're being asked to show that you can analyze literature, find a gap. It could be that you're being asked to show that you can design a piece of research. It could be that you're being asked to show that you can do a close reading of a literary text. It could be that you're being asked to discuss historical events and the reasons why things happened and the reasons why they're presented in a particular way. But in every case, there will be a skill that you're expected to show along with just the knowledge. Okay, so remember what I said before, this is not an educational context where you're just being expected to learn things and repeat them back. You're being expected to demonstrate that you can do things and switch contexts and all those sorts of stuff. So you can literally hopefully you can see that you can literally take that set of questions and apply them to any context that you're in. I mean, perhaps for some of you who are postgraduate students or postgraduate research students, that might be less obvious, but even in that situation, I think you can see how a very similar set of questions might help you. So for example, what am I trying to achieve here with my research? What am I trying to achieve with the question I've set myself? Why does my question matter? What does my response to this question contribute to the existing knowledge in this discipline? How does it fit in with existing ideas and debates? These are all questions that you can be asking yourself as an independent researcher, as a postgraduate student, either at taught or research level. So hopefully you can see that, and those are the questions that I want you to take away, to apply to your own context, to think about how you build your own argument. Let's do that with the example question I gave you then a little bit. So the context for this example, as I just clicked on the chat and I can't read and talk at the same time at this stage of the workshop, so I'll leave that question until afterwards. The context for this example is it was taken from a module, as I said, which was called British Society and Culture. Okay, now that does imply a national context. Okay, so we're talking about feminism within a British context. So that tells you one thing that you need to be considering. But it's also really important to know that the purpose of the question was not just to discuss feminism. It was to discuss the themes of the module, which is about how we understand and think about society and culture. Okay, so the key, and then feminism was the context within which those themes were being discussed. So any student approaching that question had to be aware of those two things. Now, the other important thing was that I gave a lecture in that module, which was actually called Why Feminism Was the Most Important Movement of the 20th Century. So I wasn't expecting students to agree with my argument necessarily. I certainly wasn't just wanting them to repeat it back to me, because that would have been very boring for me to read. But I wasn't expecting them not to engage with my argument at all, which is what some students did on that module. So I had some students who wrote me an essay, and what some of them did was either just write a long history of feminism in 20th century Britain, saying what happened and saying it was important, but not really saying why, just giving me a history, was not saying why it was important as a movement. But what a lot of others did is said, no, feminism wasn't the most important, it was trade unionism. And then wrote me an essay on trade unionism. Now, no other movements were discussed in this module. So the purpose of that essay question wasn't to make that argument. The students weren't being asked to compare movements. What they were being asked to do was to engage with that question. And as I said, they were being asked to do that in a way that demonstrated knowledge of the theory discussed in the module, as well as knowledge of feminism. Now, what that perhaps means is we could rephrase this question to suggest what I was really getting at. And if I was going to do that, it would be something like the following. Okay, so it would be, what arguments can be made that feminism is the most important movement of the 20th century, and how convincing are they? That's really what I was asking the students to do. Now, you could say, well, the problem here is, Dave, that you should have written a better essay question. And that is almost certainly true to some extent. And indeed, the next year I taught the module, I did rewrite the essay question, not to something exactly like this, but to something a bit different. But whilst that's true, I can absolutely guarantee you that I am not the only lecturer in the world who writes bad essay questions. And also that a student who actually sat down and thought about why I'd asked that question and related it to what we discussed on the course would have written a good essay. And indeed, many people who chose that essay title did. It was a minority of students who made the mistakes I'm talking about. And whilst to some extent I think it was my fault, it's also, what I'm saying is you could have avoided that trap by doing all of the things that I just said. Because one of the most common complaints from lecturers is that students don't answer the question, okay? And often that is not because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of effort. It's because, it's not even necessarily because they don't write something that is interesting or to a given standard correct. But what it is not that they don't end up thinking enough about the answer, it's that they don't think clearly enough about what the question is asking of them. So in other words, they don't spend enough time thinking about what we've just done here, which is thinking about the starting point, thinking about the question. Okay, so often when I find when people discuss building arguments, what they talk about is the end point. They talk about the answer that you give, what they might call your thesis or your thesis statement. This essay will argue that. And they will talk to you about how to structure that to make it more convincing. And they will talk to you about how to get your reader to that point, to build a logical chain, all of those sorts of things. Or, as I did a minute ago, show you how creating a particular structure can create a rhetorical effect. And all of that is important. And there are questions that you can ask yourself to help you do that. So again, once you've written something, or once you've produced an argument for a presentation, or once you've kind of come up with an idea that you're going to say in a seminar, whatever it might be, you can think, well, have I actually answered my question? Have I dealt with all aspects of it? Have I considered any counter arguments and challenges to that question? And are all of my points supported well enough with evidence? So, I mean, that's a set of questions, again, that you can take away with you and apply any time that you're trying to build an argument, particularly in an assignment. All of that is vitally important. And I would also say as well that all of that stuff is covered in the two books that I've written as well. So I'm not saying that I don't deal with those things. It's just that I thought it was more useful here today. The reason I wanted to focus on the beginning was to show, hopefully I've done so, that the problem with arguments is often not about where you're trying to get to, but rather about where they've started off from. Okay. And the key thing here is that you are never starting from scratch in an academic context. Okay, your discipline only exists as a collection of all of the writing and the knowledge that has been produced by other academics in that discipline. Your, whatever it might be, your essay, your report, your assignment is your contribution to that existing body of knowledge. So you're never starting from scratch. You are always standing on the shoulder of giants, as that's a quote from Isaac Newton, by which he just means, yes, you're always using what's already there to build yourself higher. So what you should be doing is trying to build your argument within the context of the module or the course. So if you're an undergraduate, that's particularly important, or a postgraduate taught student, someone doing a master's, think about the module that you're taking, the course that you're taking, and how what you're doing fits in within that. And even if you're a postgraduate student doing a PhD or a similar piece of independent research, again, what you should be doing is contextualizing this within your discipline, how this fits in with what's already there, to make sure that you understand what context you're starting from. And it's also the same when you're considering the text that you read, okay? So hopefully the logic of that makes sense. And I'm aware that I haven't gone through how to structure arguments, but a key point I would make there is that structure varies widely depending on the subject that you're doing and what it is you're trying to achieve. And one of the key ways that you can learn that is by being, again, an active reader. So when you're reading, as well as all the questions that you're asking yourself in order to critically engage with what the text is saying, also look at it as an example for how you write texts. So when you read, think about what makes the convincing argument. If you read an article, or you read a text, or you read a book, or whatever it was, something that particularly, or you listened to a lecture by one of your tutors that you found particularly convincing, what was it about it that made it convincing? What does a good answer look like in your discipline? That's a key question to think about. So find your starting point before you set where you're trying to go. That's what I'm getting at. You can't know what your final endpoint is before you work out where it is that you're starting from. So let me just sum up this section then, the key points that I wanted to make in terms of building your arguments, to add to those ones we had for reading your arguments earlier. So when you are trying to answer a question, think, what is the question you're trying to answer, and where did that question come from? Whether if it's set by a lecturer, then it's why did the lecturer set it and not another? What is the context it's coming from? If it's a question that you set yourself, then why did you set that question? Why did you pick that question and not another? Why do you think that's the important one to ask versus another one? And as with reading something, think about what the assumptions and the context are. And one thing we haven't looked at today is to think about our own assumptions when it comes to that. We have to be equally aware of the own assumptions and predispositions that you have to thinking about things when you're bringing them to bear. So we talked a little bit about confirmation bias. There are lots of other ones there, but just be aware of what you bring to a text whenever you read it, and be on the lookout for alternative approaches to the one that you have. But vitally, think about how this fits in with what you're doing. How does it fit in with what you're doing as a student, and how does it fit in with your subject as a whole? And then, as I said, remember that practical purpose. What is the purpose for building this argument? What is it that you're trying to achieve with it? What assignment are you trying to get a good mark for? What are you trying to show your lecturer that you can do? What are you trying to convince someone of? What do you want the results of this argument to be? And how can you do that practically? And then finally, think about what a good answer looks like. So what does it mean to produce a good argument in your context? And to a certain extent, that's not something that I or anyone like me can tell you. And if someone suggests that they can, then don't believe them, because there's not a one size fits all answer here. Part of the point about universities exist as, or should exist as, the place for the creation and the transmission of knowledge. And there is a huge variety of the way that is done. And we kind of tend to put things in neat boxes. But actually, if you talk, the older you get and the more you talk to people who went to other universities than you, or if you go to multiple universities, you'll realize that something might be the same subject, might be approached very differently in a different institution. So what a good argument looks like doesn't just vary from subject to subject. It varies from place to place, within a country, even sometimes within an institution, even sometimes from teacher to teacher. So what you have to do is take questions like the ones that I've given you today, so that you can be making sure whenever you find yourself in a new context, you're using those questions to work out the rules of the game that you're playing at that particular moment, and how you build a good argument within that particular framework. Now, it perhaps seems like a counterintuitive thing to do when I'm here kind of trying to sell you my book, to say that there is no magic recipe book or formula for arguments, but there isn't. You know, there are some tips that you can have and some ideas for way of rhetorically structuring things that might be useful. And there are examples in the book, but that's what I wanted you to take away is the best way to build good arguments is to think about what you're doing and why. And crucially, to think about how does your subject as a whole ask questions about the world? And how does it answer them? Because that's what all subjects are. They're a way of asking a particular set of questions about the world to try and find out new things. So how does your subject do that? And how does your argument fit in within that? And if you take the questions, hopefully like the ones I've given you today, then you'll be able to do that and work out what's going to work in the context you find yourself in. Okay. That's everything that I wanted to tell you. So now I will hand over to you and say, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask?
Well, while we wait for anyone to put any questions into the Q&A section, we do have a few people that submitted some pre-submitted questions when they registered. So I thought maybe I'll read one of those out, Dave.
Yeah.
So the first one is a little long. It is, more than a central argument, I would be interested in learning how to articulate and present a chain of mutually reinforcing arguments. For example, how my research question links to my hypotheses, to the lit review, to the research design, and so forth.
It's an interesting question because there's a couple of separate parts in that for me. There's how do I create mutually reinforcing arguments, and then there's that particular type of format where you're setting a hypothesis, setting a research aim, saying how your data reaches that. I'll deal with the second one first. I think, again, in each case, what you have to think about there is what arguments you're making and how they fit in with each other. So there's a variety of ways that something like that could work. Often what you're doing in that sort of structure where you do a literature review and you use that to inform your research question, your research question then feeds into your methodology, which is where you make an argument about what the best way to do that, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of by its very nature, those arguments are going to be self-reinforcing because you have to think about what your purpose in each case is. So a literature review, and again, this is a mistake that students often make, a literature review is not intended to just be a summary of what other people have said. A literature review always has a purpose. And that purpose is to say, I have read all of this literature and here is the important thing that you need to know about that. Now, that important thing to know about that is normally, well, what's the gap? That's how it's referred to, finding a gap in the literature. But we know that that doesn't necessarily mean there's something that hadn't been done. It could mean we need to do more of this, or it could be this has been done really well, so I'm going to do it again. But whatever it is, you're telling a story, you're making an argument that says, here's what's already been done. And within that context, I'm saying that this is what another piece of research, i.e. this one, needs to do. So that's the purpose of the literature review and setting the question. Your methodology section is then making an argument about why the approach you've taken is the right one to answer that question. And again, you will have written your literature review in a way, if you've done a good job, that shows that. Okay, so if for example, you're arguing that there's lots of quantitative data on a question, but there's no qualitative data, then if you've written your literature review well, when you get to your methodology section, you'll say, of course, we're doing this in this way, as we and your reader won't ask why, because you'll have told them that there's no other studies that have done that. And then your discussion, once you've got your data, should close the loop and refer back to those previous points to make the overall argument that you want to make. So that's one answer. In that particular context, I think it's about thinking about the purpose of each individual part and how they relate to each other. The example I've just given is just one way of thinking about it. There's lots of other types that you could end up doing, but again, it's thinking about what's the purpose of each individual element. From a different perspective, in terms of creating mutually reinforcing arguments, that's not always what you're doing. So sometimes what you might be doing is building a causal chain. So you might be saying, well, we've got one argument and that leads on to this, and then that leads on to this. Other points you might be facing things off against each other. So you might be saying, well, here's a simple reading, but actually here's a more complex reading. Or you might be saying, here's a side that everything says yes and everything says no, and you play them off against each other. In each case, the structure should be a function of what you're trying to argue rather than the other way around. And that's what I meant by there not being a recipe book, because too often I think students fall into the trap if they go and look at a book that says, okay, this is a good structure, and then they kind of pour their argument into that mold. That you're not doing, that's not the right way around. What you should be doing is shaping it based on the argument you want to make, if you see what I mean, rather than the other way around. So when you need to create mutually reinforcing arguments, then that might be the way forward. But actually, that's often not what you're trying to do. I hope that's a clear answer for that person.
We have a question in the chat about they were asking about which book you've referred to from this, and I'm assuming that's the content of this event. They've said you have a book coming out in May 2023. Is this the one you are referring to, or the older book? So I think that's what they mean with that.
It's both. So as Maria said in the introduction at the beginning, the Build Your Argument, the one that's already out, is a much more kind of pocket-sized version, much briefer version. Everything that I've talked about today is touched upon there, and there's a lot more in there as well about how to structure arguments, how to incorporate counter arguments, but it's all in a much more kind of easily digestible format. I'm not suggesting that the other one isn't easily digestible. All I mean is it's designed to be something that's for use quickly. A lot of similar stuff is covered in the bigger book, but in much more depth, basically. So both, I think, if you're interested in a kind of from a very immediate practical purpose, so for something to pick up to give you some guidance when you're writing something, the shorter version is good. The longer version is if you want to get a bit deeper into it, or it does go into certain things in more depth as well and give more examples. That's the other key thing.
Thank you.
We've had a question in the Q&A actually. So this person has asked, can you speak a bit more on structuring an argument verbally?
Yeah, okay. And that is one thing that I probably go into in more depth in the longer book than in the shorter book, although it is covered in both. But yeah, I do talk in more depth about structuring an argument verbally. I think it's really important. Firstly, often what students mean when they ask about this is presentations, is having to give an assessed presentation, because it's one of the most anxiety inducing things for being, as a student, for a lot of people at least. So I think the key thing there is that actually most of the time structuring something verbally is the same as structuring something in writing. Like, for example, the example I gave of the Trump meme and how to read it, I wrote that for the book in the same way as I delivered it verbally today. What's often the key in terms of structuring something for speech, become very inarticulate here. The key for structuring it for delivery verbally or orally is actually about the language that you use and doing things and repetition, signposting, and all of those things. It's remembering how the person on the other side is engaging with what you're saying. So if someone's reading it, it's much easier for them to stop, to go at their own pace, to go back and forwards, to reread something if they didn't quite get it. If they're listening to you, that's their one chance. So you need to make it very clear what the key points are. You need to make it very clear how all those points fit together. And you need to make the structure fairly straightforward. I guess that would be the key thing. It's perhaps useful to have less very complex structures if you're giving something in a presentation. But the key thing is, I think, more is just to flag it. All I mean by signposting language is to say what you're doing. Now, in some senses, that's very simple. So it could just be things like saying, firstly, I want to talk about this. Now I'm going to move on to talk about that. Having talked about this, you will hopefully have noticed that I did that today. So I said, now we've talked about reading. What I want to do next is to move on to talk about how we build our own arguments. All that is signposting language. But signposting language is also doing things like saying, and this is the really important point. And this is why this is important. So we all know what it's like to listen to someone talking. It's easy to zone out and to miss a key thing. But if someone says the phrase, and this is really important, your brain switches back on and you're going to listen. So I would think about, I think basically the same rules of structuring apply, but I would just think about how you're actually using language in order to help your listener follow what you're saying, rather than worrying too much about the structure. Hopefully that helps.
Great. I'll just pop back to some of our pre-submitted questions quickly. One of our attendees said, a good argument may not be considered as good for people who are more senior than us. or for those who specialise in different disciplines. So it's just so it's a bit of a statement, but what do you think about that?
I think there's two things there. I think the first one is that smacks of what people call imposter syndrome, which I think most of us are very familiar with, which is, as I mentioned, I think somewhere towards the beginning, that tendency we have to think that we're not worthy, or that some people are going to realize that we don't know what we're talking about. Or that tendency to look at our lecturers or the people who've written these books as being experts, that we can't possibly be on the same level of them. And that's simply not true. I think even if you don't feel like you are, you have to remember that that's the role that you're supposed to be playing as a student. You're a member of the academic community, and the academic community is a community of equals. So yes, you're a trainee member of that, but the people who are senior to you are absolutely interested in your argument, and they absolutely think it's valid. I have, every time I teach something, someone comes up with something that I've not thought about before, or puts something in a way that I've not thought about before. And a good argument is a good argument. It doesn't matter if it's been made by a first-year undergrad or by a professor of 30 years. The question about from different disciplines, that is interesting and is something that's worth thinking about. For example, my partner she's got a PhD in literature as well, but she's currently doing a master's in history, because at the institution where we work, you can do it for free alongside work. And that raises all sorts of questions about what a good argument looks like in history versus what a good argument looks like for a literature degree. And there is a difference, and certain types of way of presenting things as a literature student would get you a bad mark for a history student. But you can learn from that. But what that doesn't mean that someone would look at it and say that's a bad argument. They would look at that and say, well, actually, no, as a historian, I want you to talk about X, Y, and Z. But that's where the reason why I took the approach I took today, because by asking yourself the question of what does a good answer look like in this context? What is this question asking me to do? Why is the lecturer asked this question? You should hopefully not do that. And there is no such thing as a rule that can't be broken in academia. If you want to break that rule and ask it a different way, as long as you can say, and the reason I'm doing this is because I think this is more convincing, then an academic will accept that. Interdisciplinary encounters in any question are to be valued, as long as you're doing it deliberately, rather than just looking like you're doing it because you don't know any better.
We have a couple more pre-submitted questions. So there's one more here, which is, how can we refine our arguments if other people suggest changes or improvement that are required?
That's an interesting one, because it depends who you mean by other people and how that works. I think there's multiple contexts to that. And I think the key thing is that arguments are a process. And so any position that you take on something, you shouldn't be viewing it as a position that is fixed and not for changing. And that's as true, as I said before, of a scientific perspective as it is of a philosophical perspective, because facts change. That's what science does. It's constantly challenging the knowledge that we have in order to try and improve our understanding of things. So the first thing is that understanding that that change is possible and indeed desirable. So you're not defensive about it. And secondly, it's an interesting one, because it's about taking on board what someone is actually saying to you, and then considering whether or not you agree with that and therefore need to make a change to what you've argued. That might sound like a very obvious thing to say, but that change could be minor or it could be massive. So what you have to consider is, if someone's making a change, well, does that actually invalidate what I've said? And do I need to rebuild this from the ground up? Or is actually what I need to do to just make a slight change to it that recognizes that counter argument, that recognizes that there's a valid counter argument, but still doesn't actually say that tips the balance? One way of thinking about that is that you could think about a kind of scale, if you like. So quite often we set up a binary where we say, on one side you've got this argument, whether it's a yes or a no is obviously the simplest binary, but it could be, for example, what's the purpose of going to university? Is it to get a good job, or is it to pursue knowledge? So knowledge and money would be the either end. Where are you on that scale? And it could be that taking on board someone else's comments move you from being 89% knowledge to 70%. Do you know what I mean? That moves you a little way down the scale. So it's kind of shifting your position a bit, just thinking about how much that is. in terms of how you refine that argument, it depends when you're doing it. So if it's a redrafting process, then it's about going back through and trying to consider the different levels of abstraction that you're working on. So is it just that I in order to incorporate that person's suggestion, I just need to insert a sentence somewhere that recognizes the counter argument? Is it a more fundamental structural change that I need to incorporate? It depends on what you're doing. I think one useful rule to think about in terms of when you're arguing in person, so in class, is to think about the sort of Carl Rogers model of argument, where he says, which is a famous one, which is in the longer book, not the shorter book, where he talks about a thought experiment, where he says, if you want to actually have a proper argument with someone, before you're allowed to make your point, you have to repeat back what the other person said to their satisfaction. So in other words, to kind of make sure that you actually fully inhabit their position and think about why they're saying it and where they're coming from, and don't just do what most of us do, which is wait for our turn and try and win. Okay, and so that's the other thing. If you're in a class discussion situation, actually be really open to the idea of improving your argument, and treat the argument as not something that belongs to you, so that is therefore a threat to you if it's proved wrong. So that you feel like you've been personally insulted if someone says you're wrong, but actually the idea is something that exists that all of you are discussing, that you're trying to come up with the best version of that you can. So a kind of collaborative project. Now, you might not come up with a consensus, but if you treat it as something that is not kind of your precious baby, then hopefully you will be much more open to the idea of improving it from other people's feedback.
Great. We've had some, while you've been talking about that, we've had a few questions from people sort of live. So the first question on that list is, have you noticed any innovations in producing arguments? That is to say, something out of the norm?
I'd be really interested to know what the context of that question is, because the answer is yes and no. I mean, I think you could, obviously, argumentation has a very long history, and the kind of a lot of books about arguments would start with kind of, Aristotelian logic and going back to the classics. And you can do that. You can look at the way that people make arguments today and say, yes, it's using the same principles as people used 2,000 years ago and longer. But obviously there are also the unique and the individual and the interesting happening now. And I think, so in some senses, no, there is, arguing has a very long history, and you are building on that tradition, and it's something that constantly mutates. So often something that has happened in the past will happen again now, but also there are developments that happen for all sorts of reasons, some of which are technological. So there are kind of forms that exist that haven't existed previously, and I think I notice very much that generations that have come after me, it's sad that that's plural now probably, rather than single, engage with knowledge in a very different way, in a very different set of forms, or have a wider set of forms. I also think there's something interesting with the way that certain boundaries have been broken down. I think whilst labels still exist, there's both a proliferation of labels and a tendency to be less rigid about them. I think you can see that in all sorts of social contexts, but I think you can also see it in knowledge context as well. And some of the most interesting things that I've seen in terms of things that are out of the normal, what I was talking about a second ago, interdisciplinary kind of questions. So where instead of knowledge being constructed in a silo, so someone always works like this, you find people work, collaborations between people in different departments, or someone who just brings a different way of thinking to bear on a traditional way of looking at a question, and something very interesting is produced. And actually, if you look at the history of most disciplines since the sort of 1970s, it really is a history of that. It is a history of that happening, of all of these fascinating new ways of thinking about the world being introduced as someone says, well, actually, what happens if we apply this way of thinking to our subject? What happens if we apply deconstruction to history? What happens if we think about history from a feminist perspective? I don't know why I'm choosing history. What happens if we think about, for example, what happens if we think about the way that medicine is taught from a feminist perspective, and the fact that the male body has dominated anatomical representations in textbooks? How has that affected things? So these are all ways of kind of mashing makes it sound very unscientific, bringing together different perspectives and using them to create new things. So it's happening all the time, and I think that's exciting. And I think the other thing I would encourage people to do as a student is to absolutely give yourself credit, to kind of go against the imposter syndrome and go the other way. Or you are a unique individual. I don't necessarily mean that you're better than anyone else, but you are unique. The particular set of circumstances that has brought you to that place, and with the combination of knowledge that you have, means that you might ask a question in a way that no one ever has before. And be open to the idea that what you're thinking might be something that no one's ever thought before. Often you go down particular little paths because up to a certain point, we're all taught in a fairly standardized way. So the idea is that you leave school having the same knowledge as the person next to you. Once you get to university, the whole point is that you're following a different path. You choose different modules, you get interested in different things. By the time you come out of the other end of that, whether it's a master's or an undergraduate degree, you've got a unique set of things that you've done, a unique set of reading that you've done, a unique set of thoughts. So the possibility for uniqueness is always there. That got a bit romantic towards the end, but hopefully it made sense.
We have another question here in the Q&A section. How do we conclude an argument in a paragraph without saying that it's a possible area for future research?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's nothing wrong with saying that something is a potential area for potential research. What you want to make sure is that that's not just a cop-out, because I guess one way to think about that is if the immediate response to that question is, well, why didn't you do it then you've got a problem. So don't say it, in other words. But if you can legitimately say this is outside the scope of this particular essay or this particular research, but the best answer we can give based on what we've got at the moment is this. I think that's the key thing, is to make sure that you're making a clear answer, that you're coming to a clear position. That clear position might be nuanced, it might be equivocal, that might be the best that you can do, but kind of coming to the best point that you can, and not referring to what, again, my partner calls the history GCSE answer, which is to say, and in conclusion, there are just too many factors, so it's impossible to say. That's not an interesting answer. The answer is you have to give what your answer is on that occasion. So do the best you can, basically.
We have a question in the chat that's an interesting one. I don't think we've ever been asked this subject before, so prepare yourself. But it's been in the news recently about AI being used in academia to write essays. Do you think such arguments are mere scaremongering, since setting and producing arguments are human endeavours which no machine learning can reproduce?
It is a very interesting question. Yeah, it's something that I'm very interested in, and the kind of area that I work in is very, very interested in, because whilst I teach all students, obviously we do a lot about language, in particular, and how language is used, and in supporting international students and non-native speakers of English and all those sorts of things. And there's a lot of scaremongering in that area because, you know, for all the obvious sorts of reasons. I think there's a few things to say. I think I'd be loath to say that academic intelligence can never do it. I think there might come a point in which academic artificial intelligence is perfectly capable of doing it. I think at the moment what we're seeing is we've seen an exponential improvement in what AI can produce, and it can produce very, very convincing text, and it can produce text up to a certain point. It can produce arguments up to a certain point. There are still many things that it can't do. There is the kind of, as you say, the human aspect of what it can't do. So I think where we are at the moment is, I think what this is already doing is forcing academics in all sorts of different subject areas to think about what it is they're actually testing with a particular assignment type. The tendency for most people is that we test people in the same way that we were tested. You know, so I did literature up to PhD. If I was teaching literature, I would probably set essays and presentations in the same way as I was asked to, because that to me seems like the way that you test whether people or not people can do it. But actually having AI that can write that essay, well, what's the value in that? What's the value in getting someone to do that? And is there still a value? The answer might be that the value in getting someone to do it is demonstrating and making sure that they have the ability and the understanding to construct arguments in that way. And so the problem might not be, it might still be that we have to stick with the same forms, but it might be that actually, you know, that form becomes obsolete, and actually we test the kind of human element in another way. And often what that will mean is that is actually not that the final thing changes, it's just the way that we put it together changes. So, I mean, AI can already do a huge amount for people. So you can use it to summarize text, for example. You could use it to kind of start off a literature review process to help you decide which texts are going to be more useful to you or not. And that could save time. You could use it to give you ideas for structure, for example. Now, I think in a current academic context, what you then have to make sure that you do is that you then do the individual thing, the human thing that shows what you can do in order to get the qualification, because otherwise all you're teaching yourself to do is how to use chat GPT. You're not teaching yourself how to be a psychologist or a sociologist, whatever it might be. But I don't think we can write off AI, and I think there will come a point when this will just be seen as another step in the development of the way that knowledge is produced and shared. You can be facetious about that and go back to the printing press, but think about the internet. I mean, having the ability to look up any fact that you want instantly was the same challenge 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And that had to change the way that exams were set, the coursework were done, and all those things. And we've got used to that now. We don't think about it. And again, that didn't mean that we could just do away with learning facts, that we could learning things, which is the sort of opinion pieces that you're talking about now about AI. Those were the sort of opinion pieces that were written then. We don't need to teach people facts anymore. What's the point? They don't need to learn anything because they can just look it up. Well, we know that's not true, actually, and learning still does involve that. But we don't make people learn great chunks of thing by rote anymore, because we know that they can look these things up, in the same way as there are certain types of maths that we don't teach anyone to do it in school anymore, because we know they've got calculators, so. And I think AI will be the same thing. We'll go through a period of pearl clutching and people having great moral panics, and then we'll come to a point where people probably will still be writing essays, will still be presenting things. It might be that some testing is done in different formats. So it might actually be that the in-person exam makes more of a comeback, because they want to test what you can actually produce on the spot under pressure. I don't know how it's going to play out, but AI is definitely not going anywhere. And I think it could be, that was a very cliche thing to say, apologies, but it will definitely get a lot better very quickly as well. And I think it's fascinating to see what that's going to look like, because I don't know about anyone else, but if you I read an essay that an AI bot had written on Zizek the other day, and if I'd marked it, I'd have given it a 2-1. It's at least a 2-2. And I know lots of people who say that you can get an AI bot that will write you a 2-2 essay pretty convincingly at kind of undergrad level. So you're covering your face in horror at that comment. But like, the level that we're at is incredible, and that was impossible a year ago, 2 years ago. So what's it going to be like in 2 years? It's going to be very interesting. I know, Vic, I'm not suggesting you go and write your essays via ChatGPT. Please don't do that. You'll put me out of a job as much as anything else.
I'm just taking a look now, because we've gone through all the questions that have been sent in.
I think we've got time probably for one last question. What do you reckon, Siddharth? Which one are we going to go for?
Oh, there's one that's been sent into the chat. Should we ask that one then?
Yeah, let's go for that one.
All right. So what kind of impact do you think teaching how to understand and produce a good argument might have if it were taught in secondary schools and further education? Good question.
It is a good question. I'm a little bit hesitant to say too much, because I am obviously quite out of touch with what secondary schools teach now, because it's been a terrifying amount of time since I was at one, and my children aren't yet old enough to go to one. But I do deal with obviously a lot of students who've just been through secondary school in this country. And so my answer would be, I think it's really important, actually. And I think that one of the most harmful things I've seen about tendencies in certain types of secondary education particularly is to make writing something very formulaic. There's all these models that people have been taught to use and how to write a paragraph, things like peel or petal, or there's loads of different. TEEP is another one. Point, evidence, evaluation, link. Like this idea that you can make every paragraph the same formula with the same 4 parts in it. And what people end up writing is just a list of bullet points and not an argument or an essay. And actually, I think teaching people how to argue is one of the most vitally important skills. Actually, I think that good teachers do still teach that. I think that no matter what curriculum you set, you can't stop good teachers teaching people to do that, because they will be interrogating what they're presented with. And I already see, even from the primary school that my children are at, that they are being taught to argue, not explicitly, but actually they are being presented with the idea that there's more than one way of looking at the world. And as soon as you've got that idea, you are implicitly teaching people how to argue, even if it's not explicit, because you're teaching them that they have to navigate their way and pick which way they want to look at that particular question. That's the reason why it's important, because that is the truth. That there is no one fixed way of doing things, and you have to navigate that and know how to ask questions and answer them. But I do think it's already there. So I think you can always argue that it should be more there. I am certainly very much more a proponent that we should be educating school children, and in further education, we should be educating people to think critically and argue well, rather than getting them to learn by rote. I'm not a fan of the sort of Michael Gove route of making people learn when the list of when the kings were. I don't see how that's a particularly helpful approach to knowledge. But I do think it's there a lot as well. So I don't think we should despair.
It's probably very useful in their own lives as well, with all the social media things that are out there. So
yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that I would say about all of this stuff, with all stuff to do with academic skills, and I haven't really said it as much today, but it's something I normally bang on about, is that any academic skill is just a real life skill in a different context, and everyone already has those skills. People who don't think of themselves as being brilliant at arguing, if you put them in a situation where they're talking about something they're knowledgeable and passionate about, they will be brilliant at arguing. That might be, about football, it might be about computer games, it might be about food, where the best fried chicken is from, it might be, how to make the best jollof rice. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, but you put them in the situation where they're passionate and knowledgeable, and they will be building arguments. Often the best thing that you need to realize in order to do that in an academic context is just to make the link with what you already know and the things that you already do, and realize that there's validity in that real life skill. And it's just about putting it into a new context and learning a new set of rules. A bit like people get intimidated by academic rhetoric, the academic voice, how academics sound and the way things are written. But actually, we've all got experience of learning how to speak in a different context. And we all speak in different contexts, so I'm a football fan. I know that I talk in a different way about football. When I go to the football on Saturday, I'll talk in a particular way, because that's how I've learned to speak in that context. When I talk to my students, I talk in a particular way, because I've learned the language around that. And we all do that, and we've all done it multiple times. And I think demystifying academia and not seeing it as something special that's only for people who are, important in particular ways, it's not. It's just another context with another set of rules that anyone can learn.
We just had a question in the Q&A, and it's not one for you to answer, so you'll be able to be pleased about that. But they're just asking about some critical thinking resources. So we've just put a link into the answered, and I'm just going to put it into the chat as well, because I think it's a really good point that Sage Publishing have a whole host of free resources on their website. So I'm just going to pop the link into the chat, because it's all for free. So make the most of it. And on our portals and on our YouTube page, we save every event video that we've posted. It's quite a few events now. So if there is an area that you're interested in or you need help with, then have a look through all the different videos. There's very different presenting styles. So you might find something that works well for you. But yeah, there's loads of content out there, and it's all free for you to view. So we're going to be sending out an email that will have all the information that you need from this event. So links to Dave's books, links to this video, so you can watch it again as many times as you want, links to the YouTube page, and also a copy of the slides. So you'll have all that information ready for you to work through it and really to make sure that you understand the material. But I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone, so all the attendees, and for the questions that you asked. And Dave, thank you very much. That was a brilliant event, and I think it was really good to see all those questions being answered. And I think that a lot of people will appreciate the sort of, especially the sort of imposter syndrome styles of like, actually your opinion's worth worth having. I think that's a really important thing for students to remember.
Thank you.
So,
And thanks for everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I hate just finishing the event because it chucks everyone off. So I'm just going to warn everyone in advance that the event, when it finishes, it was very sudden, but we're just going to say thank you and goodbye, and then we will disappear off your screen. So thank you everyone for attending, and goodbye.